The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has been in the news a lot lately. Last week she was dragged into the furore over the migrant boats and came under much criticism for her policies on migration. But this week she is being celebrated in certain quarters of the country as having ushered in a major win for freedom of expression campaigners. What has she done? Well, under her watch, the Home Office has issued a new code of practice, a draft code. It hasn't been approved in Parliament yet, but it has been or will be laid before each House. It was published today, Monday the 13th of March 2023, and it is entitled Non-Crime Hate Incidents, Draft Code of Practice on the Recording and Retention of Personal Data. The Independent and many other papers today are running with the story, saying that the Home Secretary's position is a pro-free speech one and that free speech is to be prioritised over taking offence. Under the guidelines, according to the Independent today, the police will only record so-called non-crime hate incidents when it's absolutely necessary and proportionate to do so, not simply because someone is offended. And Ms Braverman is also quoted as saying officers must have freedom of expression at the forefront of their minds when deciding whether to record a non-crime hate incident against somebody's name. So in order to explore at least part of the new document that has been published to assess whether or not it is a gigantic step forward or a tiny step forward or even a little bit of sliding in a direction as yet undetermined, we need to go back to the original definition of a non-crime hate incident and to remember, for those of us following it, it'll be emblazoned on our memories forever, but for those less familiar, we should familiarise ourselves with what the problem with the non-crime hate incident was. Well, a non-crime hate incident is defined, paragraph 11 of the draft code, as an incident or alleged incident which involves or is alleged to involve an act by a person, the subject, which is perceived by a person other than the subject to be motivated wholly or partly by hostility or prejudice towards persons with a particular characteristic. Well, there were two issues with this. When it was first raised that these things exist, non-crime hate incidents, because to be honest, nobody really knew they did exist until one individual, Mr. Harry Miller, was approached by police officers from Humberside Police Force and told that he had to watch what he was saying on Twitter about transgenderism. He needed to check his thinking. He probably needed to do a bit of self-education. They came to his place of work. They lectured him on how transgenderism operates as a phenomenon in the world. And then they informed him that they were going to record a non-crime hate incident against his name, which, after due research, Mr. Miller discovered could possibly be stored on a database that could be disclosed at a later date in the context of, say, a DBS check for a job application. An infringement not only of his Article 10 rights to freedom of expression, but potentially also his Article 8 right to privacy. So the big problem that Mr. Miller had with the non-crime hate incident was twofold. One, it creates some sort of sanction akin to prosecution for a criminal offence for activity which is wholly lawful or not criminal. In doing so, it creates an expanding jurisdiction in our legal framework for non-crime crime, which obviously blurs the boundaries between criminal activity and lawful activity, including lawful speech and potentially criminal speech. And that was the first problem, that grey area, not least compounded by the fact that the non-crime hate incident would be decided by an investigating officer, and the decision to record a non-crime hate incident against someone's name, again arbitrarily decided by an individual police officer with no real criteria for that officer as to whether or not they should or shouldn't record it. Arbitrary sanctioning of people for potentially lawful activity in the guise of a non-crime crime. It doesn't really instill confidence in the police on the one hand, and on the other hand, it creates as was discussed extensively in the Miller case, a so-called chilling effect on speech generally. If one person is brought up short by the police for tweeting something offensive, then it will deter others from tweeting similar. And of course, when it comes to important political debates that the country is having about migration, about net zero, about transgenderism, and about the sex, protected characteristic of sex versus the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, participation in those important public debates is muted and it's repressed. If there is a chilling effect, people won't be willing to participate in political debates. They won't be willing to share their views. They won't be willing to share the views of others on social media and like platforms. And this, of course, has a corrosive effect on democracy. And that point has been recognised multiple times in our own courts and, of course, at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which has made clear that political speech is especially to be protected at law, and that without freedom of expression, the concept of democracy as we understand it falls away. So it's one of our foundational democratic rights. And the non-crime hate incident seems to drive a truck through those protections of speech by creating what I've described as a grey area between lawful speech and potential criminal actions. That was the first problem for Mr. Miller. And of course, the second problem is, I've already alluded to, the subjective element, which is that any person can perceive a speech act to be hostile to somebody with a so-called particular characteristic, and I'll come back to particular characteristics in a minute, but that is a subjective decision. And if they are able to report somebody and the police decide to record that person as having committed a non-crime hate incident without any due process whatsoever, or the person complained about having any right of reply, then there is clearly an infringement on that person's Article 10 rights to speech, which is indeed what the High Court and the Court of Appeal agreed had happened in the case of Miller. But of course, organisations like the Free Speech Union and the Bad Law Project recognised that even with Mr. Miller's victory at the High Court and the Court of Appeal, if the police continued to record non-crime hate incidents against someone's name without clear guidance as to when it would be permissible to do so, then the problem hadn't really gone away. It had just been highlighted by the High Court's decisions. And so a campaign has been ongoing by various free speech champions to get the Home Secretary to take seriously the fact that non-crime hate incidents in many respects are just not fit for purpose if we live in a society that we say is democratic, and if we live in a society that we say is governed by the rule of law and recognises and respects enshrined and fundamental human rights, such as the right to freedom of expression.